Audience discretion is advised due to potentially distressing and sensitive material. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on 21st of May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to parents Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a research chemist and his mother was a teletype machine instructor. Some sources report that Dahmer was deprived of any kind of affection from his parents as an infant, while others report that he was doted on by both parents even though his mother suffered from depression and mental issues for most of her life. It is also said that he lived in turmoil at home and his parents were constantly in a state of tension and most communications ended up in arguments. Even though the marriage was shaky, his parents had a second child, a boy, who Dahmer was asked to name, and he named his little brother David. Dahmer was reportedly an energetic and happy child before he underwent double hernia surgery before he turned 4. When Dahmer was in first grade, his father Lionel was mostly away from home due to his studies and work, and he was left with his hypochondriac and depressed mother who demanded constant attention from her husband and spent most of her days in bed, not looking after her 7-year-old son. This and the fact that his mother tried to commit suicide when he was really young but could still recall the incident led Dahmer to believe at a very young age that he was, quote, unsure of the solidity of the family. End quote. So it isn't surprising that at elementary school, Dahmer was described as shy, timid, and quiet and didn't have many friends. Even teachers noticed early signs of abandonment in the 7-year-old, which became even worse after Joyce got pregnant with her second son. David, Dahmer's younger brother, was born in Ohio after the family moved there in 1966. From an early age, Dahmer showed interest in dead animals after he witnessed his father removing animal bones from beneath their house at the age of 4. His father stated that he was, quote, oddly thrilled by the crackling noises the bones made and became mostly obsessed with animal bones which only grew from then on. He started searching beneath and around the house for animal bones and explored the bodies of roadkill to see where their bones were located and how they looked on the inside. In 1968, the family again moved to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio, which was their third move in 2 years and which made Dahmer's 6th address since being born. All this moving around was no help to Dahmer's inability to find friends and becoming sociable. Although the good thing for Dahmer about this new house was that the house was located in 1.5 acres of woodland, where he got the chance to collect large insects and skeletons of small animals like chipmunks and squirrels, what he was really interested in from a very young age. Later on, he started storing the remains of the animals in jars of formaldehyde and stored them in a hut near their main house, which had kind of become his cave. When Dahmer was 10, over a chicken dinner with his family, he turned to his father and asked what would happen if he placed the chicken bones in bleach. Lionel was pleased that his son was showing interest in science and saw this as a chance to bond with his son since his mother was basically hands-off when it came to parenting, so he showed Dahmer how to safely bleach animal bones. What Dahmer did next was to add this process to his bone collecting. The same year, Joyce increased her daily intake of Equinol, laxatives, and sleeping pills and became more distant from her family. These small but shattering shifts in their family dynamics and locations resulted in Dahmer becoming more obsessed with his fascination with roadkill and his relevant hobbies. He explained to a friend that he was curious about how the animals' coat fit together, and in one instance he found a dead dog and decapitated the dead animal before nailing the body to a tree and impaling the skull with a stick. He later showed his work to a friend as a prank and said he had come across the dead dog in passing. By the time he was a teenager, Dahmer started drinking beer and hard alcohol. However, he didn't just drink on occasion. He started drinking in the morning by the time he was 14. He sneaked in alcohol in the jacket he wore to school, and when a classmate asked why he was drinking in a morning history class, he just shrugged it off and said alcohol was his quote medicine. In high school, he was described as polite and highly intelligent, though still an outcast. He got only mediocre grades and was a very competitive tennis player. He was also considered the class clown who faked seizures at school and local stores in town, which became known as quote doing a Dahmer, which he made money out of and spent it on booze. When he hit puberty, he discovered that he was gay, but never told his parents. He even had a brief relationship with a boy from his school who he left his prom date for a couple of hours before returning to her. They never had intercourse. It was then that he started fantasizing about dominating a totally submissive male partner by his own admission. In addition, his fantasies revolved around focusing on the chest and torso. When he was about 16, he saw a jogger that passed by his house every day, whom he found extremely attractive, and started fantasizing about making him unconscious with a blow to the head and making sexual use of his body. He even went as far as hiding in the bushes and waiting for him with a baseball bat. But on that certain day, the jogger didn't show up, and this was Dahmer's first attempt to attack someone. In 1977, Dahmer's parents got started on marriage counseling in an effort to save their relationship, but since Lionel found out that Joyce had had a brief affair, they got divorced. They intended for the divorce to be as amicable as possible because of their two sons, but they continued to bicker and the whole thing became bitter, which led to Lionel moving out in 1978 and starting to live in a motel. The same year, Dahmer graduated from high school, and shortly after, his mother Joyce moved out of the house with her younger son David, without telling her soon-to-be ex-husband. This meant that Dahmer was living alone. 3 weeks after his graduation, Dahmer was driving down a road near his house when he spotted a hitchhiker who had been hitchhiking to a rock concert. Dahmer stopped and lured 19-year-old Mark Hicks to his house, inviting him in for a drink, and since he had the whole house to himself, they went in for a few beers. According to Dahmer, the sight of his bare chest stirred Dahmer's sexual feelings. At the same time, Hicks started talking about girls, and this made alarms go off in Dahmer's head that even if he did make a pass on him, it would be useless. So instead, after hours of drinking, talking, and listening to music, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell when he wanted to leave. Dahmer stated Hicks, quote, wanted to leave and I didn't want him to leave, end quote. Apparently, he struck Hicks twice from behind while Hicks was sitting on a chair. After he fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him with the bar of the dumbbell. He then proceeded to take off his clothes, exploring his chest with his hands and masturbating as he stood above the corpse. The next day, Dahmer dissected Hicks' body in the basement and buried the remains in a shallow grave in the backyard. He dug up the body several weeks later and tore off the flesh off the bones and dissolved the flesh in acid, like he had many times with animal remains, before flushing it down the toilet. To get rid of the bones, Dahmer used a sledgehammer to crush them and then scattered them in the woodland behind his house. Remember that at this point, Dahmer was basically living alone, so doing all this was simple enough. It was 6 weeks later when Lionel finally found out that Dahmer was living on his own when he dropped by to check on his sons. Lionel had a fiancée by that point. The coming August, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University and majored in business. Since he still had a drinking problem, he failed his subjects and got a GPA of 0.45. He dropped out just after 3 months of university. Having noticed that his son was abusing alcohol, Lionel insisted that Dahmer enlist in the army. He trained as a combat medic and put on a show for his family of doing great in the army and putting his life together. Though the truth was really different. He got several warnings about being intoxicated, and due to his alcohol abuse, his performance deteriorated and he was finally honorably discharged from the army. But this meant that he didn't feel like he could go home and face his father. So he traveled to Miami Beach to run away from his reality and because he was tired of the cold, as he stated later. In Miami, Dahmer tried to live by his own means, so he got a job at a deli and rented a room in a nearby motel. Since he spent all his money on booze, he finally got evicted from the motel. He didn't have anywhere to go. so he spent his evenings on the beach and still worked at the shop. But finally, he got tired of living like this and phoned his father and asked him to come back home. He then moved back to Wisconsin and moved in with his father and stepmother, doing chores for them around the house till he landed a job. He continued to drink heavily and was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct only 2 weeks after returning. He was fined $60 and given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. In the hopes of making his son quit abusing alcohol, Niall sent Dahmer to live with his grandmother since she was the only person in the family who he showed any affection towards. He hoped that her attention and affection would ultimately help him heal. Again, he did chores for her around the house and even accompanied her to the church and looked for a job in order to get his life together. He was hired by Blood Plasma Center and worked there for 10 months before being fired. He was again unemployed for 2 years and lived on the pocket money his grandmother gave him. During this period, he was arrested again for indecent exposure. There were 25 people, women and children. He was fined $50 plus court costs. In 1985, he was hired as a mixer at a chocolate factory. Even though he was arrested twice, continued smoking and drinking, was out of a job for long periods of time, Dahmer didn't have any other victims for many years. But while reading at the West Allis Public Library, a man propositioned him through throwing him a note offering to perform fellatio on him. Dahmer didn't respond to him, but this incident caused his fantasies of domination and control to come back to life. He began to go to gay bars and gay bathhouses, and became a regular customer. He even went through a lot of trouble to steal a male mannequin from a store so he could sexually relieve himself, until his grandmother discovered it and told him to get rid of it. Dahmer described the bathhouses as relaxing and referring to them said, quote, "I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of people," end quote, and then revealed that he got tired of his partners moving during the act. And I know you can guess where this is leading. Keep this in mind. Now, in 1986, Dahmer began giving his partners at the bathhouses liquor laced with pills and sedatives, which he'd gotten from doctors because of his job as a mixer, since he worked 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. He then waited for them to fall asleep before performing sexual acts on them. After doing this around 12 times, the bathhouse caught up and revoked his membership, which made Dahmer move on to hotel rooms to carry out his act. When Dahmer met Stephen Toomey, a 25-year-old resident of Michigan, at a bar on November 20, 1987, he was staying with his grandmother in West Allis. Dahmer convinced Toomey to come back to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where he had reserved a room for the evening. Dahmer claimed that instead of killing Toomey, he just wanted to drug him and lay next to him while he examined his body. When Dahmer woke up the next morning, Toomey was lying under him on the bed, his chest crushed in and covered in bruises that were black and blue. Dahmer had deep bruises on both fists and one forearm, and there was blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. Later, Dahmer claimed he didn't remember killing anyone. After buying a sizable suitcase, Dahmer used it to carry Toomey's body to his grandmother's house. A week later, he disemboweled the head, arms and legs, filleted the bones, and then sliced the flesh into manageable chunks. Dahmer put the flesh in plastic grocery bags. He used a sledgehammer to smash the bones into splinters after wrapping them in a sheet. It took Dahmer about 2 hours to dismember him. He threw away Toomey's entire body, aside from his head, in the garbage. After Toomey was killed, Dahmer kept Toomey's head covered in a blanket for 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, in an attempt to save the skull, Dahmer boiled the head in a solution of bleach and Soilax, an industrial detergent with an alkali base. He then used the skull as a trigger for masturbation. This bleaching process eventually made the skull too brittle, so Dahmer threw it away. Dahmer claims that Toomey's murder was a turning point in his life, and that he never again attempted to resist his urges. He started going out looking for victims, most of whom he met in or near gay bars, and would usually entice them to his grandmother's house. He would give his victims triapalam or temazepam either prior or right after having sex with them. He killed his victims by strangling them until they lost consciousness. Dahmer met James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American prostitute, 2 months after the Toomey killing. Offering him $50 to pose for nude photos, Dahmer enticed him to his grandmother's house. Before Dockstader was drugged by Dahmer and strangled on the cellar floor, they had sexual relations. After a week of keeping the body in the cellar, Dahmer dismembered it in a manner reminiscent of his treatment of Toomey. With the exception of the skull, he disposed of Dockstader's entire corpse in the garbage. Dahmer discovered that after boiling and cleaning the skull in bleach, the process had also left it brittle. 2 weeks later, he ground the skull to a powder. Dahmer first spoke with Richard Guerrero, a 22-year-old bisexual outside the Phoenix, a gay bar, on March 24, 1988. Guerrero was lured to the house by Dahmer, who offered him $50 to stay the night. He gave Guerrero sleeping pills, used a leather strap to strangle him, and had oral sex with the corpse. Within a day, Dahmer had severed Guerrero's body into pieces, throwing the bones in the garbage once more and keeping the skull to grind up a few months later. Ronald Flowers Jr. was invited by Dahmer to his home on April 23rd. However, after giving Flowers a drug coffee, Dahmer's grandmother called asking, "Is that you, Jeff?" The grandmother noticed that Dahmer wasn't alone, despite the fact that his response gave the impression that he was. Dahmer was unable to murder Flowers as a result. Flowers was taken to the County General Hospital by Dahmer after he lost consciousness. Dahmer's grandmother asked him to move out in September 1988, mostly due to his drinking, his late-night habit of bringing young men to her house, and the stench coming from the garage and basement. On September 25th, Dahmer moved into a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street that he had found. He was taken into custody 2 days later after drugging and molesting a 13-year-old boy he had tricked into coming to his house to pose nude for pictures. Gerald Boyle was retained by Dahmer's father to represent his son. Before his court appearance, Dahmer underwent a number of psychological tests at Boyle's request. According to the assessments, Dahmer experienced intense feelings of alienation. 2 months later, a second assessment found Dahmer to be an impulsive person who is wary of people and shocked by his lack of achievements in life. In a report to the court, his probation officer also cited a 1987 diagnosis of Dahmer's schizopersonality disorder. Dahmer entered a guilty plea to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and luring a child for immoral purposes on January 30, 1989. The sentence was put on hold until May. Dahmer moved back into his grandmother's house on March 20th and began a 10-day Easter break from work. 2 months post-conviction and 2 months before his sentencing, Dahmer killed Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old mixed-race aspirant model who he'd met at a gay bar on March 25, 1989. Dahmer claims that he wasn't planning to commit a crime on this specific occasion, but that evening, right before closing, Sears, quote, "just started talking to me," end quote. After luring Sears to his grandmother's house, Dahmer drugged and strangled Sears after they had oral sex. After putting the body in his grandmother's bathtub the next morning, Dahmer proceeded to decapitate it and then try to flay it. He dismembered the body, removing all the flesh, and threw the bones in the garbage. The first victim from whom Dahmer permanently kept any body parts was Sears. He preserved Sears' head and genitalia in acetone and kept them in a wooden box, which he later put in his work locker. Dahmer claimed to have found Sears' quote, "exceptionally attractive." He took the remains with him to his new address when he moved the following year. Dahmer was sentenced on May 23, 1989 to 1 year in the House of Corrections and 5 years of probation with the option of work release to allow him to maintain his employment. He had to register as a sexual offender as well. Dahmer was released from his regiment on parole 2 months prior to his planned release. At this point, his 1989 5-year probation period started. Dahmer briefly returned to his West Alice grandmother's house. Dahmer took Sears' mummified head and genitalia with him when he moved into 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, on May 14, 1990. Dahmer's new apartment was furnished, close to his work, and affordable at $300 a month, all utilities included except electricity, but it was located in a high-crime neighborhood. After relocating to this address, Dahmer killed Raymond Smith in less than a week. With the promise of $50 for sex, Dahmer enticed Smith, a 32-year-old prostitute, to his apartment. He gave Smith a drink that was laced with 7 sleeping pills inside the apartment, and then he manually strangled Smith. After buying a Polaroid camera the next day, Dahmer used it to snap multiple images of Smith's body in suggestive poses before mutilating him in the restroom. He rinsed the bones in his sink after boiling the arms, legs, and pelvis in a steel kettle filled with Soilax. Smith's skull was removed, and Dahmer dissolved the rest of his skeleton in an acid-filled container. Later, he spray-painted Smith's skull and placed it inside a filing cabinet on a black towel next to Sears' skull. About May 27th, 1 week after Smith was killed, Dahmer invited another young man to his apartment. This time, Dahmer unintentionally drank the sedative-laced beverage that was meant for his visitor. The next morning, he found the man had taken a watch, $300, and a few articles of clothing. Dahmer told his probation officer that he'd been robbed on May 29th, but he never reported the incident to the police. Edward Smith, a 27-year-old acquaintance, was drawn to Dahmer's apartment in June 1990, where he was drugged and strangled. This time, Dahmer decided to store Smith's skeleton in his freezer for a few months in the hopes that it wouldn't retain moisture, instead of immediately acidifying the skeleton or going through the bleaching process that had made the skulls of earlier victims brittle. The victim's skeleton became acidified several months after it was frozen because the moisture was not removed. When Dahmer put the skull in the oven to dry, he unintentionally destroyed it, which is why the skull exploded. Dahmer later told the police that because he'd lost all body parts, he felt, quote, rotten about killing Smith.